Globalisation has been a hotly contested term since it entered the lexicon some 3 decades ago. As Robinson ruminates, the proliferating literature on the notion reflects the intellectual enormity of the task in researching and theorising the breadth, depth, and pace of changes underway in human society. While primarily considered in regards to its presence in the economic context, globalisation operates on multiple scales and assemblages and is inherently linked to the cultural. As an anthropologically driven phenomenon, this inventory intends to highlight the ways in which globalisation affects and absorbs, informs and interacts with intangible elements of society. Crane, in her 2011 paper, describes cultural globalisation as the stretching of connections, relations, and networks between human communities and increases the intensity of these. By investigating these links, I'll explore how individuals act as both products and agents of globalisation. My name is Erin Brown, and like many other Anglo-Saxon Australians, my lineage in the lucky country extends only as far as a few generations. For the most part, I grew up thinking we existed in a cultural vacuum. Culture belonged in the palaces and museums of faraway places. While this concords with Borman's definition of culture in the cliched sense as established by Bordeaux, as in the signifier between the elite and the typical dregs, the fine arts and the smut of the masses, it restricts the all-pervasiveness of culture, and denies the complex legacy of imperialism, colonialism, and migration in our country. It is this rich and complicated history that has rendered me an inherent and unconscious product of globalisation. Phillips highlights in her piece, What is Culture? The culture is rather ordinary and only realised when confronted with cultures other than our own. Extrapolating further on this, Preston notes culture as both arbitrary and commutative. It is a ubiquitous human trait that is in a constant state of change. As such, I want to explore the ways culture affects how I am an agent of globalisation through implicit and implicit means, primarily through international travel and the things that I consume. At an immature 15 years of age, I ran off to France in search of supposed culture. While rather fruitless, I happened to live in a small country town, it did inspire within me a love of international travel. In less than 2 years, I've been fortunate enough to traverse the European continent, spending time in France, Spain, Germany, the Netherlands, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, and have made numerous trips to the Southeast Asian region, particularly Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and Malaysia. Through these expeditions, I'm a definite agent of globalisation. In immersing myself in their specific context, I've absorbed select cultural practices while rejecting others. For example, in participating in a local culinary course in Hanoi, Vietnam, I've returned to Australia and prepared this dish for my family. Food is, in my opinion, one of the most taken for granted products in the cultural global exchange. Especially in our multicultural society, it is not uncommon to pass a Thai restaurant, then a Chinese, maybe an Indian, then perhaps a pizza bar, all in the one strip, without thinking anything of it. Inglis highlights that in Nietzsche's attempt to describe cultural essence, he looked to matters of cuisine. In an increasingly globalized world, culinary dishes are no longer restricted to the cultures in which they originate. This notion is explored by Lee in her TED Talk, The Hunt for General Tso, where she discusses how Chinese food in the US, an industry with more numerous than their infamous fast food chains, has provided a delicious avenue for cultural hybridity. Pierre Turst defines cultural hybridity as the ways in which forms become separated from existing practices and recombined with forms as new practices. Just as I have now incorporated traditional Vietnamese cuisine into my everyday diet, cultural hybridity relates to how we are able to select and reject particular aspects of cultural practice. Food as a product of globalization that renders me an agent takes me to my next point. Consumption plays a significant role in the ways I am an agent of globalization. One such custom I had not been aware of was my participation in our country's eminent coffee/cafe culture. Drinking coffee is often silently and unanimously regarded as a social affair in Australia. For this reason, our cosmopolitan hubs, such as Melbourne and Sydney, have been recognised as icons on the international foodie scene. The fact that there exists even such an accessible movement is indicative of our increasingly global community. As studies indicate, coffee is one of the most important and actively traded commodities in the world, and a remarkable example of a globalised product in its own right. With particular attention to Melbourne, the development of the cosmopolitan cafe society has long been attributed to the influx of European migrants, mainly Italians, after World War II. Drawing upon what I'd mentioned earlier, in that Australia's history is complicatedly informed by colonialisation and migration, the abolition of legislation such as the White Australia policies of the early mid-20th century has drastically altered our cultural milieu. In a world governed by neoliberal strategy, it is not uncommon for your barista-made coffee to be from Ethiopian or Colombian beans. However, this is rarely fully contemplated. I'll avoid going on a tangent dealing with the economic and social disadvantages that commodification places on third world countries, but will refer to a point raised by Inglis. In his 2010 piece, Food and Globalisation, The Dialectics of Globality and Locality, he discusses how globalized commodities lead to the loss and perhaps reimagining or adaptation of cultural import. This conjures a paradox of cultural practices. With coffee being so accessible, its significance as a cultural practice is denoted and often ignored. But in line with Phillips, who stresses the mundanity of culture, we see its place in Australian culture as legitimate and vital. Through first-hand experience, I can vouch that my first action after alighting from an international flight is straight to the nearest cafe for finally a good coffee. Through my coffee consumption, and an unfortunately large amount at that, I'm an agent of globalisation in that I have adopted it as a social ritual of sorts and a product, for industry relies on my caffeine-dependent individuals like myself to keep it alive and flourishing. In the short time allocated for this inventory, I've obviously only been able to scratch the surface of my engagement in cultural globalisation. While two seemingly insignificant cultural practices, they grant me access to a highly globalised community, and that over centuries has become the norm. It has also allowed me to reflect upon the ways I consciously and unconsciously participate in cultural activities that have long been influenced by historical links and connections.